Hi, everyone. I'm Phyllis Curott. It's my great pleasure and honor to be hosting our conversation today, a very important conversation on the impact of the witch hunt trauma on modern women. I'm also the program chair of the 2021 Parliament of the World's Religions. I'm an attorney, I'm an author, I'm a Wiccan priestess, and I'm one of America's first public witches, a witcha, W-I-C-C-E, someone who is retrieving the wisdom traditions of my Euro-Indigenous ancestors. And with me are two very remarkable women, and I will tell you a little bit more about them in a moment, Max Dashu and Marilyn Nyborg. And we're going to have a very important conversation today that I have been wanting to have since my first parliament in 1993. And as I was saying to them earlier, this is the time. This is the moment, this is the place to have this conversation. And these are the remarkable women with whom I'm so looking forward to having it, and with all of you. So thank you for joining us. So I just want to explain very, very quickly my perspective, and then I will give the floor to them. Wicca, it turns out, W-I-C-C-E, is a 5,500-year-old word, a Proto-Indo-European word, which linguists are fascinated by and are beginning to come into agreement that it means a wise one, a seer of the sacred, a shaman, essentially. The 16th century word, witch, is probably the most charged and misunderstood and probably one of the most dangerous words in the English language. It immediately conjures stereotypes of hideous hags worshiping the devil and women being tortured and mutilated and burned at the stake. It's a word that carries the projection of our patriarchal culture's fear of women, of their power, their sexuality, their roles in society, and their divinity. And the fact is that today, every woman, regardless of their faith tradition, whether she knows it or not, carries the witch trauma within her. And our culture reflects this deep wounding in countless ways. And yet at the same time, witchcraft has become the fastest growing spirituality in America. And women know that by reclaiming the word witch, they are reclaiming their freedom, they're reclaiming their spiritual roles, their wisdom, their power. And so today, to discuss the origins of the witch trauma and also its ongoing impact on women in society, I'm honored to introduce Max Dashu and Marilyn Nyborg. And I will begin by reading Max's wonderful, the brief bio. She's internationally known for her expertise on ancient female iconography, including the divine in female form, medicine women, shamans, witches, and witch hunting. She's the author of Witches and Pagans, very important work, Women in European Folk Religion, and Pythia's, I'm gonna mispronounce this, is it Melissae? Melissae, and Pharmacadis, Women in Hellenic Culture, which is going to come out shortly. She founded the Suppressed Histories Archives in 1970 to research women in the global cultural record, and it had a profound impact on me and on countless other women I know. From her collection of some 50,000 images, Dashu has created and presented hundreds of slideshows at universities, community centers, bookstores, conferences, festivals, schools, and libraries. She teaches with images via her web courses, which are marvelous, live casts, and the Suppressed Histories Archive Facebook page and stream on demand videos. And if you're not familiar, you should be, and I send you there. And Marilyn Nyborg, marvelous Marilyn Nyborg, became a successful business owner of a high-tech recruiting firm in Silicon Valley for 25 years. Marilyn has worked with HUD to gather evidence of housing discrimination for class action suits. She's coordinated Black-white encounter groups, bringing together diverse members of the community to explore racial bias. And she's the co-founder of Gather the Women Global Matrix. Most significantly, I think, well, the others are also extremely important, but that's a profound accomplishment. Marilyn has taken her lifetime of experiences in sacred activism to develop a network to restore feminine wisdom, values, and influence in the service of all life. She's committed to a world that creates change in cultural values, personal choices, and policies worldwide that shift humanity's consciousness from separation and domination to integration and unity. She's the author of Sacred Activism for Women. She's a speaker and a teleseminar leader and producer of a video, The Book of Jane, the story of woman. And I'm just so personally honored and delighted to welcome Max and Marilyn to have this important conversation with me and with you. And so we're going to start with a presentation that Max is famous for. She's kindly given us a briefer version, but profoundly impactful. So Max, if you'll begin.
Okay, 1 second here. Get this to full screen. Come on now, PowerPoint, do your thing. I don't know why it's not going to full screen. There we go. All right, so I'm going to be sharing what the reason why we're talking about all this. I'm going to show you a glimpse of what happened. And we need to deal with the impact of centuries of misogynist repression. We have older legacies of women's spiritual leadership in Czechia, in this case, a lot of folk traditions about these seeresses and dreamers and healers, the Scandinavian seeresses, Gaul, Britain, Italy, Germany, Bulgaria, Lithuania, all the countries really had this. And the earth revering traditions in which wise women, real witches, were teachers, witches, teachers and healers. And this passage, Swa Wiccan Tacha, as the witches teach, shows that they were in fact spiritual leaders. But here we are looking at the witch burnings that overwhelmingly targeted women from the early Middle Ages and forward. And so the ordeal of hot iron, and this was a female ordeal. Here's an example from medieval Spain. This was also something that was practiced in Germany. And you have these female ordeals by fire and iron to prove chastity and female submission. We don't have very many images from this early period and hardly any trial records, but the chroniclers do record burnings in the early Middle Ages. And not only at the stake, but also on pyres, burned alive by the state or lords or cities, not necessarily the church. Sometimes they drowned women who were accused of being witches. Soon after establishment of the Inquisition, they reintroduced judicial torture, which caused an explosion of wild accusations and burnings. And secular power burnings begin to expand into inquisitorial witch trials in the late 1300s. I'm going to get this to change here. People assume it was all the church, and the demonology starts there, but both church and state were involved in the burning of Jeanne d'Arc, a figure that many people will have in fact heard of. Most of these are unknown. And we have theologians and the Inquisitions coming up with diabolism, the idea of devil worship, and especially demonological fantasies of sex with devils, the incubi and succubi. And this became a major factor in the torture chambers. They promote misogynist theories of oversexed women and female inferiority as the cause of witchcraft. So here are the Malleus Maleficarum. And you see the God the Father, God the Son above, and the demonized naked old woman below being tortured by devils with ropes. This was an actual form of torture. And they prosecuted accused witches on these charges of having sex with devils, and they burned them alive. So denunciations proliferated, and there was no defense that would work. They also accused midwives of infanticide and of consecrating children to folk goddesses, of ceremonies to the fates or fairies, divinations about the future of the child, protective rituals by the women. The high death rate of babies in that era was blamed on midwives and other older women who were demonized as baby killers, a central theme that arose in persecution against contraception and abortion by those same midwives. And violence against women was rampant. It was sanctioned by both church and state in these patriarchal societies. And so you have a battering of wives, even carved into churches, which is what this is from, but also in canon law, also in state law, also in folk custom. These were patriarchal societies to begin with, but now the enforcement really ramps up. And they're accusing witches of being responsible for men's violence. Also, witches accused or women accused of spectrally attacking men. So this is not an actual event, but she goes in the spirit and she's tearing his hair and she's beating him. And these are accusations that were actually raised against real women. And also, accused witches were said to be counseling battered women, women with man trouble. And they were saying that they were preventing men from beating their wives and of using healing charms. So these are actual witch trials in Italy. We have others in France and Scotland where battery is mentioned as part of the pattern that's going on. And women's only resort was the village wise woman. If they were deserted by their husband, if he was beating her, if, whatever kind of trouble they were having, the priest wasn't going to help them. And so they had to go to the old wise woman. And so we see actual herbalist healers like Bellezza Orsini in Italy being tried for healing, for using herbal medicine combined with olive oils. And they were demonizing these women in the trial. So under the torture trial, they're trying to force her to say that she spread diabolical powders, she's a baby killer, but she resisted and she tried to make a quote unquote confession that would show that the witches were actually fighting the devil. And none of it worked. Nothing she said made any impact because they would only accept the confession they wanted. So she commits suicide to avoid any further torture where she would be forced to betray her own spirit. And so we have the demonization of the old woman counterposed to the saintly friar. And this is the education of a young man who becomes a witch hunter in his adult life. So these burnings escalate, and old or middle-aged women are the primary targets. There's a lot of lines of persecution, but we see this stereotype of the old witch here shown as a country woman with a distaff, a symbol that's associated with the mysteries of the witches, the old meaning of the term. And these are our primary targets, are these old women, old poor commoners. But sexual politics loom very large in the accusations. And so we see contraception, impotence magic, women accused of making men impotent, love spells, also all kinds of disasters being blamed on the accused women. And so these common women, here's a country rural peasant woman with a straw hat, attended by animal spirits who are her helpers. This is a shamanic theme that is demonized in these persecution, these old pagan roots. And we will see dragons, especially in Germany, female dragons, dragon goddesses attending the witch. In the literature, including the broadsides that were handed out. This is the scandal sheet press of the days that sold like hotcakes, reporting the burnings and reporting the accusations and spreading this frenzy against women as crowds pack in to watch them being incinerated alive. The animal spirits and the land spirits are still around, but now they're being turned into devils. And they appear as devils in the witch literature. So you see women dancing with animal men here in a typical folk festival. So the witches banquet, the witches dance. And then on this side, you see women facing all male judiciary who quickly send them off to the stake to be burned. And so this brings us around to what we call the burning times, the burning terror. In fact, this is a reign of terror, the witch hunt terror, that is torturing and terrorizing women. Everyone watching knows this could happen to you too. This is a form of social terrorism, torture as part of the execution, part of the spectacle. Who would be next? And so we have these horrific stories, these horrific pictures, the women bound, you see a lot of these aren't at the stake, they're bound to a door and burned on a pyre. And the Swiss especially created horrifically realistic depictions of what these burnings were like. And the shaving of the women's heads, they're naked. This is like a spectacle of humiliation and horror. And it's also symbolically intended to strip them, this head shaving, of their power. And sometimes they would carry the witch into court so that her feet would not touch the ground, that she might draw strength from the earth. They're blaming women for plagues, Jews also, by the way, hailstorms, failed harvests, scattering powders that cause disease, injuries and deaths of humans and animals. And the artists depict these women who are suffering terribly as having no expression on their face whatsoever. There's absolute lack of empathy. They are totally othered, totally demonized. No pain, no fear, no horror shows on their faces. And women's suffering is just the way it is. This is accepted. They are abandoned by everyone into this terrible death. Others watching as they burn. And we have testimony from the persecutors that, in fact, women are the targets. Where we burn one man, we burn maybe 10 women, according to one Swiss text in 1516. Another German account says that in 2 villages, only 2 women were left alive in the bishopric of Trier, now part of Germany. Here's a French woman, Aldegonde de Rue, who is accused in the early 1600s. And she says, but look, they say all women are witches. This is part of the overall, the misogynist thrust of this. Any woman could be accused. They didn't in actual fact accuse noble women, women of aristocratic status. And so the torture trials spread, and they created actually more accusations, more burnings. All kinds of machinery of torture comes into use. Again, in Scotland, these are secular trials. And then they say in England that there was no torture, but that would only be acceptable if you don't realize that they're starving these women, they're catching diseases in the cold dungeons, and they are depriving them of sleep for days on end when you can get most people to say just about anything. So that's called a confession. And all of this is going on. There are special witch dungeons in Germany. They call them Hexentürme, witch towers. Once she goes in through those doors, she's in the power of the jailers. They strip away her clothing. They replace it with these horrible rags that gave jailers access to her body. And of course, nothing to keep warm inside. And so what goes on behind these stone walls in the witch dungeons? We have references to jailer rape here and there. Of course, most of what happened there was never recorded. And a lot of this went on inside of the crucifix. And so we have the terrible irony of the Roman torture crucifixion of Yeshua of Nazareth presiding over the torture of actual human beings. You could not think of a more desecrating way of observing Christianity and even blessing the instruments of torture. And children are forced to watch as their mothers are tortured, which was a very effective way of enforcing the confessions. And I'll put that in quotes, confessions, not real. And these heartless men who ran these prosecutions and these executions. And so here again, another secular official. The inquisitors are overseeing this as well, but people have this misconception that it was only the church, and the state had a huge hand in this, both Protestants and Catholics. And so the torturers are ruthless, they're arrogant, and they're greedy. They're delighted for this. They're getting paid to feast and to drink alcohol while they're carrying on these trials at the expense of the victims. The torture also occurred in a public way, and this was especially true of the breast rippers, which were typically applied at the execution as part of the public spectacle. And so here you have poor Bertha Pappenheim. They've ripped off her breasts. The men are being tortured too. This is a poor family of German wanderers, homeless people. And so then there's the unfailing witch chair. And this is the worst torture, using trays of hot coals to heat up those iron spikes. And you either confess or you die. And some old women especially did resist unto the very death. The historian of witchcraft, Henry Charles Lee, called it the unfailing witch chair. So severe was that torture. We have a general figure that over 80% of, generally speaking, of those executed were women. Of those tried, of those prosecuted, of those condemned, and of those executed. Except in a few countries like Iceland and Finland, where the hunts were very minimal. and the fanaticism of this. Women, children, the old, the disabled receive no quarter from the great humanist judge, Jean Baudin, who was lauded until the late 20th century as a great man. We have the witch finders making easy money in England, France, Italy, and Austria. One of the most notorious was Matthew Hopkins. This was from a movie made about him. They would assemble the village and they would say, okay, who are the witches here? Tell us who are the witches. We'll test them. We'll stab them with bodkins and find out if they have any devil's marks on their bodies. So there's a rape element even in these kinds of initial prosecutions. And the targets mostly are old women, isolated, without support. Now, I want to talk about women's speech, which looms very large, or the suppression of women's speech in these persecutions, because it's not only those who were burned or imprisoned, it's also women who were branded, who were subjected to the witch's bridle, which had prongs sticking out that held down the tongue. And these are very often spiked as well. And in order to silence them, literally. And you can see some of the spikes on these. These could be deadly items if they pierced the palate. The infection could kill you right there. And they sometimes were equipped with head vices that were torture implements in their own right, could be tightened around her skull, these head cages. And so women were driven through the streets in a public humiliation to terrorize the female population. This is what happens if you bite back, if you scream back, if you insult a man. This is going to happen to you too. And sometimes no bridle, but they would flog her through the streets. Sometimes she would be ridden. The Spanish Inquisition was fond of riding women backwards on a donkey and flogging her through the streets. And so the goal is silencing women, and this repression had a terrorizing effect, very effective. We see the same technique also being applied in the slave states of the Americas, and they use these same bridles and other torture implements fastened to the bodies of enslaved people. Also the ducking stool, which was a form of public torture where she would be immersed in the pond or sometimes in the sewage canal, and everybody would stand around watching and laughing. Sometimes she didn't make it out alive because she would drown there before they let her up out of the water. There's also the ordeal of swimming the witch, and the Hexenbad, as the Germans call it. And so she would be lowered into the mill race or into the lake and held. If she floated, it was really a catch-22. If she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent, but would they pull her out in time before she drowned? And then we have public exorcisms, which are also ceremonies of control over women, a kind of public theater that was really effective in making everyone side against the woman. The female role of helplessness, inferiority, submission was this way dramatized. And we find possessed girls coming up in the 1600s as primary accusers. These are often abused girls in Salem. A lot of them were indentured or servant girls, orphan girls, and they're accusing adult women. And so possession is really another side of this. And with Salem, I just want to mention, a lot of people, Salem is so famous. There were more witch hunts in other places in New England. These are just famous because they all happened in one go, within a short period of time. In the larger sphere, Europe is exporting its demonologies, the burnings, the torture, and religious persecution to the Caribbean, to Mexico, and other parts of the Spanish colonial world. Now, this is a really interesting instance because we see a very clear connection. The Inquisitor Juan de Zumarraga is hunting witches in the Basque Country during the 1520s. And then as Bishop of Mexico in the 1530s, he's burning Aztecs at the stake. There's a very tight connection between the torture chamber ideologies that were imposed on European women and then the racialized demonologies that were exported into the colonial world. But meanwhile, in Europe, these burnings go on through the 1600s, into the 1700s, even the late 1700s, as we see here in Eastern Germany. And in Eastern Europe, especially Poland, Hungary, Estonia, also Scotland and Savoy have witch hunts going on into the 1700s. So there's a different timeline for different places. The last official execution is in 1782 in Switzerland, but there are others in the form of lynchings that go on into the 1800s. Finally, I want to look at outcomes, because the social effects, the legacies of hundreds of years of these behaviors were immense. We see the isolation of nonconformist women, old women, disabled women very often being stoned here in this picture, name calling, shunning, scapegoating, the dynamics of using target people, and that includes witches, Jews, many groups of people, as a pressure valve to distract from the real oppression that people are undergoing. We see scientific male objectification of women. First is demonology, then these same ideas of female inferiority are passed over into the scientific world. Woman as matter, man as mind, nature as a machine, time as linear. We see men, especially doctors, taking over female professions, the sphere of power of the healers, and a whole switching of authority, women now no longer in control of the process of birth. We see the demonization of dark peoples, indigenous peoples, non-Christians, Jews especially, Romani also, in the fantasies, the diabolist fantasies that are propagated. We see the social prescription to women: conform, stay within compass, or you'll be safe. It was a lie, but they promised that you will be safe if only you submit. Otherwise, it's really dangerous out there. And so white women especially were subjected to this particular kind of social conditioning. And then we have the rapes in the dungeons and the sexualized torture and the demonological pornographies that have deeply imprinted the idea of what sexuality is like and should be. And this is something we're living with in gonzo porn right to this day, one of the largest publishing industries in the world. We have the silencing of women, and the old witch's bridal shows a very close parallel to the ball gags. And this is pornography from like the 1960s, but this has also just, blown wide open. We see politically active women being silenced, gagged, like here Maria Cano of Colombia, for their activism and for their speech. The suffragists are heavily targeted. Here it's showing them cutting off the tongue of the suffragist in order to silence her. We have women being declared mad because their husbands couldn't control them, for being lesbians, for all kinds of social nonconformity, imprisoned in madhouses, and later on, the inquisitor is replaced by the psychiatrist, and new forms of torture, such as electroshock, lobotomy, ice baths, and forced drugging are applied to women disproportionately in the population. The old woman, the witch, is demonized, and you can look at 100 Disney movies like this and others, and also movies heroizing the male witch hunter as the good guy. And that's out there too. So this silencing and blaming of punishing of women is a cultural habit that's deeply ingrained. These legacies are branded and burned into the culture. They are unconscious for most people, but they're very active still today in the way that people are willing to attack and scapegoat women. But we are the daughters and the granddaughters and the great-granddaughters of the witches that they could not burn. And so we do resist. And we just have to become more conscious of all of this, its impact on our lives and our emotional lives and our psychology and social behaviors today. So thank you.
Thank you, Max. I think everybody probably needs a deep breath after that. Because
it's intense, sorry.
Not at all. No need, there's no need for you to say sorry. This brings right to the surface and into consciousness and awareness where it must be one of the most important moments in our collective history that that we ignore, right? The suppressed histories, and you cannot heal what you cannot face, and so these things have to be faced. And to discuss this ongoing impact now, I'd like to, and one more comment, just one of the things that we have said for a very long time is those of us who are seeking to revive the indigenous traditions, the shamanic traditions of our ancestors that were ruptured by this, is that what we did to indigenous peoples, we did first to ourselves. And that was a graphic and very important summary that you provided with us of exactly that and the connections that you drew. So Marilyn, I would so appreciate your reflections on the contemporary impact that this has had on women and what we can do about it. And thank you, Max.
I was going to say, Max, I have to first say that I'm just sort of overwhelmed, stunned. Nothing was particularly new except the graphics and the narration were very, very powerful. And thank you. You, I'm going to say, unfortunately, but fortunately, you have brought this alive for anyone viewing. So I thank you as well. I first want to acknowledge that Phyllis and Max are the scholars here. I mean, they have written the books and have done the research. And so I do hope that you are taking notes, because these two women are particularly incredibly valuable in holding our history, her history. On the other hand, my work has been sort of in the areas of social justice, the divine feminine, and the empowerment of women. Until perhaps somewhere in the 1990s, I saw another film that women did in Canada. It was part of a series of 3, and the one that I saw was The Burning Times. And I have to say that really knocked me out, as this is doing right now. It really it came home. I had heard of Salem, and I guess I thought at the time, oh, that's good. Witches are bad. They got rid of them. This is good. And I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And I can't say that I was ever exposed to anything of our history, of our specific history as European, with European lineage. So I might add that those films are still on YouTube, and there's more of them on The Burning Times that I would highly recommend for you to really understand, as Max has brought forward, what our story is and what it includes. So, and it's not to say that this was the beginning of the abuse of women. I mean, that started probably the beginning of time, but it certainly was such an intense period of time, of centuries of time, in which this was, embedded in the psyche and the DNA of every female, and probably everyone, if we believe in reincarnation. It's in there. The violence is in there. So, it seems like we have sown these limitations, the lack of respect, into every culture around women. So why is this subject so important in the 21st century? I mean, after all, it's a long time ago. This is the 21st century. Well, when I consider that particular era, even at the time that I saw this movie, I thought to myself, what was going on? I mean, what was kind of happening in the culture? Well, the church was certainly on the rise, a lot of churches, but the church was certainly on the rise. And certainly men beginning to get involved in their own education about the anatomy and health and medicine, and creating that. And universities at the time, and even those just studying and learning about how to heal, for them, the women who were healing and doing the midwifing and doing the herbs, they were a threat. They were not welcomed, and they actually became real targets then as witches. And again, they were left out of this otherwise growing field that we still exist in. By the way, I want to jump back a minute and say, in my first impact of your film, Max, they say that if you tell a lie enough, it becomes real. And boy, oh boy, hasn't it? I mean, is that not reflective of what we live in right now? What is true and what is being told to us? So that struck me as the ancient beginnings of that particular tactic, shall we say, of working with people, controlling people. So the church authorities also feared women, and they demonized Eve and her kind. They encouraged witch hunts and women's work as village healers, midwives. Their methods of healing through spells and herbs made them very vulnerable to these attacks of the emerging medical profession, the state, and the early church. Now, most of us are unfamiliar with these scriptures in the Old Testament, so I would like to offer these as well, because I was surprised. A man or a woman who is a medium or a sorcerer shall surely be put to death. They shall be stoned with stones, their blood shall be upon them. Leviticus 19. And lest we forget, Exodus 22. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. It is in the Bible. I checked it out. So the worship and the seeking of supernatural powers other than God was, of course, totally rejected. And so, but it's been around since the beginning of time, respectfully practiced in nature-based religions where witches and pagans and other people really celebrated life in all forms and revered them and praised them. And yet that too has been taken out of nature and put somewhere up in the sky, I believe. In the presentations that I have been giving about women's empowerment have included, I always include now my understanding of what had happened to us long before I had ever heard about ancestral wounds. Just how we have carried the pain of limiting women's authority, opinions, our influence under male domination. And just as we carry the physical characteristics through our lineage, do we carry both our gifts and our wounds. I mean, we might look at little Johnny and say, you know, gee, he's got great-great-great-grandfather's eyes and the same hunting habits that he had. Or we might look at an aunt who is terrified of water and has no reason to be, and then recognizing that one of her ancestors drowned horribly, and she carries the fear without the understanding. So that's what we all tend to live with at this point in time. More recently, we've begun to read about the impact of ancestral wounds being carried in our DNA and down generation to generation, and the work we need to do to heal them. I have many therapist friends who say this is becoming the conversation quite often now in therapy, is where this came from in your past. And I think part of the way in which we begin to heal is really understanding what we carry. And that is beginning to happen more and more now. And I'm always still amazed at the number of women, both young and old, who have no understanding or no knowledge. This is her story. This is our story, but all we know is his story, and he didn't make a big point of including us, obviously. So it's a very important time, very, very important time that we begin to look at what has occurred to us. And in fact, looking at your own ancestors and what have you carried in your DNA? Well, it's been centuries since the women were burned at the stake, but around the world, we hear of female circumcisions, honor killings, systematic rape, the use of rape as an instrument of war, and torture on a regular basis. And now, currently, right now, there are witch hunts going on in Africa, in India, and South America, often going after old women who are basically wisdom in her own lineage, calling her a witch. She is beaten. And a friend of mine this morning did some research and mentioned the fact that between 1960 and 2000, that's our time frame here, 1960 and 2000, has been an estimated 40,000 that were accused of witchcraft and were murdered in Tanzania alone, just there. But we do know it is occurring in other areas now. So when we like to think of that as history, we have to recognize how much that is playing a role in our lives now. So women who gain power, we've seen this constantly in the elections, et cetera, are often targets as they become threats to the patriarchy and continue to be. That's just so evident right now when you look at politics and what they're doing to the women who speak up, speak out, and have a voice. We continue to be persecuted, shamed, belittled, not good enough, too bold, too different, and made to stay silent and small. Does that sound familiar? And look what we've done to language. The original meaning of words like the crone was the crowned one, the hag, the holy one, the witch, the wise one. They were frequently the sages, the leaders, the midwives, the healers in their communities, and were revered for their wisdom and their knowledge. As history evolved and as his story evolved, and the patriarchal society took hold, the definitions were demonized, distorted, redefined, and made evil, often connected, putting witches together with Satan and sin. And also looking as if down beneath us was the devil's habitat. And more I understand that that is in fact so ignorant, because that is also the mother that gives and nurtures us every single day. So let's look at some of the patterns we carry. Have you ever felt fear standing in front of a group or going before a board in speaking your piece? Have you had that experience that you just, almost can't talk? Just trying to give voice to your opinions or your beliefs. We were undoubtedly beaten and killed for these expressions, and still we are being silenced. Lack of confidence. How many of you have felt like, oh God, if they only knew who I really was, oh, that would be shamed, it would be terrible. And yet you feel like, and I could never do that. No, why not? Why would you do that? Have you ever felt like you had to make yourself small to be in a relationship or a marriage? Causing conflict when you expressed your ideas or disagreed on social issues? Have you ever been interrupted by men in particular or corrected in mid-sentence, regardless of your credentials and your experience? I have so many friends in the corporate world that still have this occur. My friend Callie White in the UK is the founder of Silver Spoons Collective that's online. And I encourage you, as part of your education, to check it out. She summarizes this perfectly. The scars we still carry show up in many ways: fears of being seen or heard, mistrust of other women, experiences of betrayal, playing small, irrational fears of fire or drowning, rejections, fear of rejection, fear of stepping up or into our own power, fear of authority, struggles with feeling at home with ourselves, lack of roots, lack of support, feelings of disconnection to nature, patterns of victimhood, instability to stand up for ourselves, difficulty in setting healthy boundaries. The burning times smashed our sisterhood. Taught us to play small, broke our trust in the people closest to us, leaving us feeling powerless, isolated, unsafe, and unappreciated. So now, let's ask ourselves, what is the cost of healing these wounds? How will they impact your relationship? How do you heal? And are you willing? The influence of our full range of the divine feminine is rising and desperately needed. Our innate connection with nature has become one of life and death. The loss of our influence and our wisdom have brought us to the brink. There are workshops, women's circles, groups, therapists, friends who will support healing the wounds we carry and the beliefs that have been imposed upon us. Please let's bring what we're hearing today into the conversation with others in order to begin that we will heal and be healed. Thank you so much for this time and the good company I'm in. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And thank you, Max. And so we've come to the end of this brief time that we've had together, and we could spend days. But you
Yes.
have both focused with wisdom and precision and tremendous clarity on the things that are most important. And we have, all of us, carried the fear without understanding its source. And so a final word is that you have brought understanding to the world today. And that will be, I am confident, a source of great healing for women and for those who have feared women. And that is the purpose of the Parliament, to heal by understanding. And you've made an enormous contribution to history, to women, and to the work that we're doing. And I'm deeply grateful to both of you and to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you.